Jorge Chávez International Airport in Lima was bustling with activity that day. A Boeing 737-200 was preparing for what seemed to be a routine domestic flight. It was TANS Peru Flight 204, bound for Pucallpa. On board were 98 people, 91 passengers and 7 crew members. At first, the sky looked calm, almost an ally for the journey. But a powerful Amazonian storm lay in wait for the final leg. What seemed like an ordinary trip within the country was about to turn into a race against time to land safely. It was August 23, 2005, just a few minutes past 2 p.m. in Lima. TANS, Peru. Flight 204 was waiting to begin taxiing towards the assigned runway for takeoff. This flight connected 3 major cities in Peru's eastern region: Lima, Pucallpa, and Iquitos. The route covered around 1,000 kilometers, crossing the Andes Mountains and descending into the Amazon rainforest. The flight plan estimated 1 hour from Lima to Pucallpa, followed by a short stop to let passengers off and take new ones on board. Then it would continue on to Iquitos. The aircraft was a Boeing 737-200, registration OB1809P, built in 1982. It had previously flown for South African Airways and other airlines until TANS Peru purchased it in 2003. The aircraft was powered by 2 Pratt & Whitney JT8D-17A engines and had no mechanical issues, although its design was somewhat dated and lacked certain modern technologies, such as advanced systems to warn of dangerous wind shear. TANS Peru, whose full name was Transportes Aéreos Nacionales de la Selva, was a state-owned airline that had been operating since 1963. It was created as part of the Peruvian Air Force, with the goal of connecting the most remote areas of the country, particularly in the Amazon, where there are no roads. In 1999, it became a public company with private investment, although it remained linked to the state. By the mid-2000s, the airline was facing difficulties. Its fleet was old, resources were limited, and it faced competition from new private carriers such as Aerolíneas del Perú, Aeroperú. Despite this, TANS remained popular for its low fares and for flying to destinations that other airlines did not serve. In 2003, the airline suffered a major blow. Flight 22, a Fokker F-28, crashed near Chachapoyas. All 46 passengers and crew on board died in that accident. Returning to Flight 204, the captain was Commander Octavio Pérez Palma Garreta, 45 years old. He had a total of 5,867 flight hours, 3,763 of which were on Boeing 737 aircraft. Beside him was First Officer Jorge Luis Pinto Panta, 37 years old with 4,755 flight hours, but only 119 of those on that type of aircraft. Also in the cockpit was 38-year-old Gonzalo Chirinos Delgado, a pilot in training. He was taking part in an operational training program. He had 2,700 flight hours, although only 61 of them were on the Boeing 737. His role was that of an observer or trainee, and he was not supposed to take direct control of the aircraft. At 14:24, Flight 204 began taxiing along runway 15 at Jorge Chávez Airport. The takeoff was uneventful, and the aircraft started its short journey to Pucallpa. Just a few minutes after departure, the pilots received weather reports indicating the formation of a severe storm in the approach area to Pucallpa. Although the conditions were unfavorable, the pilots chose not to alter their plans and continued towards the airport, intending to assess the situation when they were closer to the storm. Later, as they began their descent at 15:03 and 10 miles from runway 02, they were cleared for a visual approach. However, the controller warned them about the ongoing storm. While descending to 2,500 feet above the ground, the aircraft began to be pelted with hail, and strong crosswinds buffeted the plane, causing concern among everyone on board. Despite this, the captain decided to press on, confident they could maintain control and land. During the descent, the aircraft was shaken by severe turbulence, and a heavy hailstorm struck the windscreen, drastically reducing the pilot's visibility. At that moment, the first officer decided to leave the cockpit and sit in the passenger section, giving his seat to the pilot in training, who unexpectedly had to assist the captain during this critical phase. The co-pilot's seat was then taken by Edgar Rojas Orellana, the airline's mechanic. At 15:05, Flight 204 was only 5 miles from runway 02, facing 30-knot crosswinds and almost zero visibility. They couldn't see anything and were beginning to fear that landing would be impossible. But with almost no time to communicate, the wind forced them down towards the ground. Seconds before impact, the cockpit voice recorder captured this exchange. Find the runway, third. I'm looking for it. We're at 10 kilometers, flap 5. Okay, flap 5. Do you have the runway in sight? No, I don't have it. Ask the tower what visibility is like on the other side so we can turn around and land there. Pucallpa Tower, Trans-Peru 204. What's the visibility on the other side of the runway? I can't see anything. Look with me. Help me raise the nose. Keep lifting. At 15:06, the TANS Peru Boeing 737 struck a swamp located about 6.5 kilometers southwest of the airport. The fuselage broke into 3 sections upon hitting the muddy ground, and a fire immediately erupted, fueled by the spilled fuel. Of the 98 people on board, 40 lost their lives, 35 passengers and 5 crew members, mainly in the forward section, where the fire was most intense. The 58 survivors, many with severe burns and fractures, faced a nightmare of smoke and flames. Some managed to escape through gaps in the fuselage, while the jungle, soaked by the rain, muffled the sound of their screams. The tragedy of Flight 204 was only just beginning. The crash site, a swamp surrounded by dense jungle, was a difficult and dangerous area for any rescue operation. At 15:10, just minutes after the impact, locals from nearby communities, alerted by the deafening noise, ran towards the scene. They faced muddy terrain and thick smoke from the fire. When they arrived, they found a devastating sight: the shattered, burning aircraft, with injured survivors calling for help, some trapped among the wreckage. These improvised rescuers managed to pull several passengers to safety, including children and elderly people, before the flames reached them. At 15:30, airport emergency teams and firefighters arrived, but the conditions made access extremely challenging. The 58 survivors were taken to Pucallpa's regional hospital, where doctors worked tirelessly to treat severe burns and fractures. Some of the most critically injured were flown to Lima for specialized care. Tragically, the crash site was looted by some individuals who came not to help, but to steal belongings from victims and parts of the aircraft. One of the black boxes was even taken, but was later recovered thanks to a reward offered by the authorities. Despite everything, the heroism of the rescuers saved many lives that afternoon. So what really happened? Why did the aircraft crash so close to the airport? The Air Accident Investigation Commission of Peru's Ministry of Transport and Communications carried out a thorough investigation into the crash of TANS Peru Flight 204, which occurred on 23 August 2005 in Pucallpa. The report concluded that the main cause was a wrong decision by the flight crew to proceed with the approach and landing at Pucallpa Airport, despite the extremely adverse weather conditions. The aircraft deliberately entered a storm that had been clearly detected on the onboard weather radar from approximately 190 miles before reaching its destination. The crew began an unstabilized descent, with descent rates exceeding 15 feet per second, which triggered the Ground Proximity Warning System, GPWS alarm. In addition, upon entering the core of the storm, with intense hail, the pilots completely lost both horizontal and vertical visibility, rendering them unable to maintain situational awareness until the aircraft struck trees and then the ground. Among the contributing factors to the accident, the report highlighted incomplete crew. The designated first officer, Jorge Luis Pinto Panta, was not in the cockpit at the time of the accident, as he was seated in the passenger section. This directly affected cockpit resource management. Non-compliance with the NOTAM issued on 31 July 2005. Total absence of standard operating procedures in the airline at the time of the accident, which greatly hindered safe flight management. Poor crew resource management skills, reflecting inadequate risk management and a lack of awareness of potential hazards. Limited capability of the air traffic controller in Pucallpa to identify the severity and danger of the weather situation, made worse by regulations preventing them from taking effective, preventive decisions. Significant shortcomings in pre-flight and in-flight planning, inadequate checklist execution due to distractions caused by the adverse weather conditions. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to give it a like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you won't miss the next reconstruction. Which flight would you like us to analyze in the next episodes? Leave it in the comments. On August 31st, 1988, it began like any other morning at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, one of the busiest in the United States. On the runway, flights take off and land without incident. Everything seems to proceed normally. At the boarding gate, 101 passengers wait to board Delta Flight 1141 bound for Salt Lake City, Utah. It is a short flight, just over 2 hours. Nothing out of the ordinary. The aircraft assigned to the service is a Boeing 727-232. A reliable trijet that has been a key part of Delta's fleet since the 1970s. Although it is not the most modern plane, it remains one of the most used for domestic routes. The crew is composed of 3 pilots in the cockpit and 4 flight attendants. The captain, the first officer, and the flight engineer have thousands of hours of experience. But today, experience will not be enough. At 8:30 in the morning, boarding is complete. The flight is authorized to begin taxiing to runway 18 left. As the plane moves, the cockpit fills with irrelevant conversations. They talk about politics, personal relationships, the union. They speak in a relaxed tone, almost as if they were not about to take off. The flight engineer goes through the checklist, but without stopping, without confirming actions with the rest of the crew. No one physically checks the position of the flaps. No one questions anything. The list is completed, but not verified. What follows is a chain of errors that will cost lives. At 8:59 a.m., the control tower gives the final clearance. Delta 1141 cleared for takeoff. The first officer takes the controls and pushes the throttles forward. The Pratt & Whitney engines roar as the plane begins to accelerate rapidly down the runway. The aircraft reaches rotation speed. The first officer pulls back on the control. The nose rises. But the plane does not respond as it should. It does not gain altitude. It barely lifts a few meters off the ground. From the tower, controllers watch with concern as the plane seems heavy, unstable. This is not normal. The Boeing 727 struggles to stay in the air, but something is wrong. Moments later, the right wing strikes an approach system antenna. The impact ruptures the fuel tank and causes an explosion. The plane violently turns to the right, loses lift, and crashes. In just seconds, Delta 1141 becomes a fireball at the end of the runway. The Boeing 727 crashes barely 1,000 meters after takeoff. The impact is brutal. The landing gear collapses, the fuselage breaks apart, and the engines tear up chunks of earth as the plane slides at high speed across the grass. A dense cloud of black smoke rises from the crash site. Flames quickly begin to consume the right wing, where the fuel was concentrated. The fire spreads violently toward the central fuselage. The chaos inside the plane is absolute. Passengers scream, search for exits, Many with burns are trapped between deformed seats. Others are unconscious. Some try to free their companions. The flight attendants, injured, try to open the emergency exits as the fire approaches. Every second is vital. Despite everything, emergency teams arrive quickly. Doors are forced open. Some people manage to escape through the smoke. Firefighters fight to contain the flames, but the fire has already consumed much of the structure. By the time they manage to extinguish it, it is too late for many. In total, 14 people die, 12 passengers and 2 crew members. Another 94 survive, although many with serious injuries, burns, and psychological trauma. The accident shocks the country. How is it possible that a modern plane, under apparently normal conditions, crashes seconds after takeoff? The National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, opens an immediate investigation. The first thing they analyze are the black boxes. The flight data recorder, FDR, and the cockpit voice recorder, CVR, reveal key details. The plane never had enough lift. The angle of attack was correct, the power as well. But something essential was missing. The flaps were fully retracted. On a Boeing 727, the flaps are vital for generating the necessary lift during takeoff. Their function is to change the shape of the wing, increasing its ability to lift at low speeds. If they are not extended, the plane needs much more speed and runway to fly. Delta 1141 never had that chance. Why didn't the pilots extend them? The voice recorder reveals conversations unrelated to the flight during taxiing. The atmosphere in the cockpit was relaxed, distracted. They talked about everything, except the plane. The checklist was mentioned superficially but never verified step by step. The safety culture had been replaced by routine. The NTSB also discovered that the takeoff configuration warning system, designed precisely to alert the crew if something critical, like the flaps is not in position, did not work. No alarm sounded. There was no warning whatsoever. Upon inspecting the system, they found corroded electrical contacts. The mechanism had not been properly inspected, and it wasn't the first time it had malfunctioned. Maintenance had overlooked clear warning signs. Everything begins to fit. The lack of focus in the cockpit, the omission of the flaps, the silence of the warning system, and a plane that should never have taken off. The most chilling part is that it could all have been prevented. The failures were not unforeseeable technical issues. There was no bad weather, no sabotage. The accident was a direct consequence of negligence, the relaxation of standards, and an environment where procedures were taken lightly. And this time, the price was the lives of 14 people. When the National Transportation Safety Board released its final report, the conclusion was clear. The Delta 1141 accident was avoidable. It was not an unpredictable technical failure, extreme weather conditions, or an isolated error. It was the result of a chain of human omissions, tolerated by a culture that had relaxed its operational discipline. The report explicitly mentions the informal atmosphere in the cockpit. During the 15 minutes before takeoff, the crew maintained an extended and irrelevant conversation, violating the sterile cockpit rule, which prohibits any non-flight-related talk during critical phases, such as taxiing, takeoff, and landing. Moreover, it became clear that the takeoff checklist was not properly executed. The flight engineer read it without active participation from the captain or first officer. No one responded to each item as the procedure requires. No one physically checked the flap indicators. No one noticed they were fully retracted. To make matters worse, the warning system, which should have detected and alerted the crew to this incorrect configuration, was malfunctioning. The alarm never sounded. No one knew something critical was missing, and Delta had no records of having properly inspected this system during previous maintenance. It was a silent failure, waiting for the exact moment to turn into tragedy. The NTSB report did not only blame the pilots but also the airline. It harshly criticized Delta's internal protocols, pointing out a lack of proper supervision, excessive tolerance for negligent behavior in the cockpit, and deficiencies in maintenance oversight. The accident forced a profound change in the industry. The sterile cockpit rule was strictly enforced across all U.S. airlines. Takeoff configuration warning systems were reviewed on thousands of aircraft. More rigorous crew resource management (CRM) programs were implemented, emphasizing communication, discipline, and effective cooperation within the cockpit. Delta also changed. It reinforced its operational standards, retrained its staff, and modified its internal policies. The accident left a deep mark on the company, not only because of the human loss, but also because of what it revealed, that even a prestigious airline can fall into the trap of complacency. Meanwhile, the victims' families faced a quieter struggle. Some sued the airline. Others dedicated themselves to promoting air safety. Some never flew again. The pain of losing a loved one in an accident that should never have happened doesn't go away. It transforms, but it never disappears. Today, the case of Delta 1141 is studied in aviation academies around the world. Not because of the complexity of the accident, but quite the opposite, because of how simple it was to prevent. It is a painful example of how routine can become dangerous when we stop respecting procedures. And also proof that aviation, no matter how much technology it has, still depends on the human factor. Air safety has advanced. Past mistakes become lessons for the future. But those lessons must not be forgotten, because every ignored checklist, every inactive alarm, every out-of-place conversation in the cockpit can be the beginning of a new tragedy. Delta Flight 1141 should never have taken off, and although 94 people survived, 14 did not. For them, and for all those who board a plane hoping to get home, these stories must keep being told, so that no plane ever falls again because of something so easy to prevent. A commercial aircraft belonging to the airline India Express, a Boeing 737-800, was preparing to land at Mangalore International Airport. On board were 166 people, most of them Indian nationals, returning home after a stay in Dubai. Flight 812 had proceeded normally for nearly its entire duration. It was a regular route, typically uneventful. But what happened in the final moments turned a routine operation into one of the worst aviation disasters in India's history. The destination airport, located in the coastal city of Mangalore, has an unusual layout. Its runway is built on a narrow, elevated plateau with steep drop-offs at both ends. This kind of setup, known as a tabletop runway, demands absolute precision and skill from the pilots. Due to the complexity involved, India's civil aviation authorities had mandated that only the captain was allowed to perform takeoffs and landings at this airport. The aircraft assigned to this operation was a Boeing 737-800, registration VTAXV, specially equipped to handle short runways like the one in Mangalore. Manufactured in 2008, this aircraft was part of the Air India Express fleet, a low-cost subsidiary established in 2005 to operate short-haul international routes. primarily to destinations in the Gulf and Southeast Asia. At the time, the airline operated around 20 similar aircraft, and many of its flights were crewed by a mix of foreign captains and Indian first officers. The captain on this flight was a 55-year-old pilot with dual Serbian and British citizenship, boasting over 10,000 flight hours of experience. In the co-pilot seat was a 40-year-old Indian first officer with a spotless professional record and over 3,600 hours of flight time. The two were expected to work together to ensure the safety of the operation, but fatigue and a series of questionable decisions would soon upset that balance. At 1:06 a.m., the plane took off from Dubai Airport without incident. The route took it over the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Sea, heading toward India's southwestern coast. Inside the aircraft, all was calm. Most of the passengers were asleep, but in the cockpit, a troubling sign went unnoticed. The captain reclined his seat and drifted into a deep sleep. Later, the cockpit voice recorder would reveal that the captain had been in a deep sleep for much of the flight. For over an hour and a half, the first officer handled all communications with air traffic control and monitored the flight entirely on his own. After more than 3 hours in the air, the first officer contacted air traffic controllers at Mangalore Airport. Weather conditions were good, clear skies and decent visibility. But there was a major issue. The airport's ground radar had been out of service for 2 days, forcing the crew to operate without a key navigational aid for landing. Faced with that situation, the first officer showed signs of uncertainty. "Radar is not available. I'm not sure what to do," he said aloud. The captain, newly awake and not yet wearing his headset, offered no response. A few minutes later, at 5:41 a.m., the crew conducted a pre-landing briefing, a standard safety procedure. However, this critical phase was handled in a rushed and superficial manner. Minimum approach criteria weren't discussed, the proper descent profile wasn't reviewed, and the airport's unique features were overlooked entirely. It was a serious omission. The approach began unusually. Instead of initiating descent at a safe distance, typically around 240 kilometers from the airport, they started descending just 148 kilometers from the destination. This forced the aircraft to lose altitude much more aggressively than recommended. Mangalore Airport leaves no room for error. Perched atop a narrow plateau, it's flanked by steep drop-offs at both ends of the runway. Every approach requires pinpoint precision with no margin for last-minute corrections. At 5:59 a.m., the captain took manual control of the aircraft. Although he was awake, it was evident he hadn't fully regained his clarity. In an effort to descend more quickly, he deployed the landing gear and extended the speed brakes. Even so, the aircraft was still flying too high. At that point, the descent rate exceeded 3,000 feet per minute, a dangerously steep rate for an active landing. Alarmed by what he saw through the windshield, the first officer voiced his concern. "We're too high. The runway is right there below us." The captain acknowledged the issue, though with a tone of resignation. "Oh, yes, we are high." In a situation like this, the proper course of action was to initiate a missed approach, abort the landing, climb, and attempt it again. But the captain didn't. Instead, he disengaged the autopilot and chose to continue the descent manually, even though the conditions were clearly unsafe. The aircraft's terrain awareness and warning system began sounding alarms. The first officer, increasingly alarmed, urged the captain to abort the landing. "Go around, Captain. This approach is not stable." Even the control tower, noticing something unusual, radioed in to confirm if everything was under control. The captain, fully aware it wasn't, replied firmly, "Affirmative." Despite all the warnings, the aircraft continued its descent. It crossed the threshold of runway 24 at a speed of 160 knots, well above the recommended limit, and still far too high for a safe landing. The aircraft touched down awkwardly, with only one rear wheel making contact, causing it to bounce. The first officer once again urged a go-around, but the captain persisted. The plane finally settled onto the runway much too late, leaving just 850 meters of tarmac remaining, far too little to stop safely at that speed. Although the auto brakes and thrust reversers were activated, the brakes were set to a medium mode, and full manual braking was never applied. The first officer warned they wouldn't be able to stop in time, and he was right. In a desperate and improper move, The captain attempted to take off again after deploying the reversers, a maneuver strictly prohibited. The aircraft failed to gain enough speed and overran the runway, striking an antenna and losing control. Seconds later, the plane plunged off the edge of the plateau, nosediving down a ravine over 50 meters deep. During the fall, it crossed a rural road, slammed into a hillside covered in vegetation, and broke into 3 large sections. Upon impact, the aircraft exploded and was quickly engulfed in flames. Despite the violent crash, 8 passengers managed to escape, some suffering severe burns. The rest were trapped inside, caught between the fire and the mangled fuselage. Within minutes, the interior was consumed by the blaze. Out of the 166 people on board, 158 lost their lives. Airport emergency crews were the first to respond, but the main wreckage lay more than 200 meters down a steep slope, making access extremely difficult. Over 100 rescue workers were mobilized, but the rugged terrain, thick smoke, and crowds of onlookers further complicated the efforts. The first to arrive at the crash site weren't emergency responders, but villagers from the nearby settlements. Many of them climbed down the steep hillside barefoot, using makeshift torches, desperately trying to rescue survivors through thick smoke and flames. A young girl was found alive, but tragically died on the way to the hospital. Though early reports mentioned 9 survivors, it was soon confirmed that only 8 people had made it out alive. The rest, trapped by seatbelts or disoriented by the fire, had no chance to escape. The scene was devastating. More than 70 passengers were burned beyond recognition, while others died on impact. All bodies were recovered by the end of the day, but for the families, the grief was just beginning. Counseling centers were set up, and several regions across India declared official days of mourning. The tragedy sent shockwaves through the entire country. The investigation began immediately. The most shocking discovery was the cockpit audio recording, over 90 minutes of snoring, confirming that the captain had been in a deep sleep for most of the flight. Upon waking, still groggy and possibly unwell, he made a series of rushed decisions without proper coordination with the first officer. There was no proper pre-landing briefing, and the approach was initiated from too short a distance, partly due to the airport's radar being out of service. Despite repeated warnings from the first officer, the captain insisted on continuing the landing. With a flawed trajectory, excessive speed, and without applying maximum braking, the aircraft was unable to stop and overran the runway. In a final desperate move, the captain attempted a go-around after reverse thrust had already been engaged, a maneuver forbidden under those conditions, resulting in total loss of control. The accident exposed critical failures, human error, technical limitations, and systemic organizational shortcomings. It left a lasting scar in the history of Indian aviation. A regional transport aircraft with 68 occupants takes off from the city of Santiago de Cuba, bound for the capital, Havana. It is the last operation of the day, and moreover, the last to receive authorization before the airport terminal closes completely. A cyclone is approaching, and the air traffic controllers hurry to clear the airspace. Weather conditions are not favorable, though they are not yet extreme. The route is short, the itinerary familiar, and the pilots are accustomed to flying over Cuban territory. Inside the cockpit, everything unfolds with apparent calm. The ATR-72 model of the Aero Caribbean company gains altitude heading northwest, leaving behind stretches of green fields and small towns. However, what these 68 occupants do not know is that beyond the cloud formations lies something neither visible from the ground nor detectable by radio. A phenomenon that, throughout aviation history, has claimed numerous lives and silently awaits the aircraft's entry into its domain. November 4th, 2010. Santiago de Cuba International Airport on the Caribbean island. Just a few minutes past 4 in the afternoon, Aero Caribbean Flight 883 accelerates its pre-departure procedures with the goal of taking off as soon as possible to avoid Hurricane Thomas, which is approaching the region. This flight had begun at Toussaint Louverture International Airport in Port-au-Prince, Haiti, with its final destination being Havana, Cuba. The itinerary included a technical stop at Antonio Maceo International Airport, located in Santiago de Cuba. In this second leg, the aircraft was to head northwest, flying over the province of Sancti Spiritus before beginning its descent toward José Martí International Airport. It was a short, direct route, though that afternoon was marked by meteorological threats. Cyclone Tomas was advancing across the Caribbean Sea, forcing the imminent closure of airports in the eastern part of the country. The aircraft in use was an ATR-72-212, a twin-engine turboprop jointly manufactured by French and Italian companies. Designed for regional flights, this model is common in both low-cost carriers and state-run airlines. The unit, registered CU-T1549, had originally been delivered in 1995 to Continental Express and was incorporated into Aero Caribbean in 2006. During its operational life, it logged more than 25,000 flight hours and completed around 34,500 journeys. The ATR is an efficient and robust aircraft equipped with pneumatic de-icing boots on the leading edges of the wings and horizontal stabilizer, as well as electric thermal systems for the propellers, sensors, and windshield. Despite being certified to operate in sub-zero environments, this model has shown vulnerabilities when facing ice accumulation, a circumstance that has caused multiple accidents involving loss of control in mid-flight. Aero Caribbean, officially named Aero Caribbean SA, was a Cuban state-owned airline founded on December 2, 1982. Its headquarters were in Havana, and its main hub was José Martí International Airport, from where it operated domestic flights and international connections in the Caribbean and Latin America, in addition to charter services and regional routes. The company was created as a complement to Cubana de Aviación to link secondary cities and routes not served by the main airline. Its fleet consisted mainly of ATR aircraft and some Soviet-made regional transport models. It operated until 2015, the year it was merged into Cubana de Aviación. Throughout its existence, it faced challenges such as a lack of spare parts, aging aircraft, economic restrictions, and limitations in operational infrastructure, factors that hindered modernization and safety levels. Even so, it played a key role in the country's air connectivity for more than 30 years. At the controls of the aircraft was Captain Angel Villa Martinez, accompanied by First Officer Luis Lima Rodriguez, both Cuban pilots with valid licenses. The crew was completed by 5 flight attendants: Raciel Echevarria, Maria Torres, Farah Guillén, Juan Carlos Banderas, and Andy Cesar Galano. Among the passengers were 61 individuals of at least 11 different nationalities. Most were Cuban citizens, though there were also Argentinians, Mexicans, Dutch, Germans, Spaniards, French, Japanese, Venezuelans, and Australians on board. Some were tourists, others diplomatic officials, and several were traveling to reunite with family members. At 1644, the Aero Caribbean ATR began taxiing along the departure runway. The takeoff was carried out without incident, and the aircraft set course for the Cuban capital. The journey began with relative calm. Passengers relaxed after leaving Santiago, while from the windows a gray, overcast sky could be seen. In the cockpit, the captain and his co-pilot routinely monitored the climb. After approximately 45 minutes of flight, the outside temperature dropped below freezing. Visibility remained acceptable, but the ATR entered layers of moisture at negative temperatures. Ice began to accumulate on the wings, in the air inlets, and possibly even on the propellers. At 17:36, the crew requested a descent due to ice formation. At that moment, the following exchange took place with air traffic control, marked by some difficulty in communications due to interference. Brief ATC instructions and responses are reproduced here, adapted to their original context.
Avión 883, pendiente tu solicitud, tiene un tránsito a la doble de su posición, distancia 78 millas, sentido contrario a 190, ¿será tomar vectores?
Es correcto, ahora por el 6880.
Aeronave que llama 883 o 680.
El 883, soy nombre 160 por el agente.
Sí, señor, le tiene un tránsito a la doble de su posición, distancia 30 millas, sentido contrario, si desea tomar vectores.
Correcto, 190,
Vira de derecha rumbo 330.
330 por la derecha y paramos el 02.
Correcto, avión 680, vire de derecha rumbo 150.
Derecha 150, el avión 680.
After this coordination, the aircraft began a right turn to a heading of 330 degrees. However, the aircraft did not respond normally and began to lose stability. The ATR swayed sharply, alternating between right and left bank, while the nose attitude shifted abruptly. With tension in their voices, the pilots tried to regain control. Moments later, at 17:42, the aircraft crashed into a wooded area near Guasimal, in the province of Sancti Spiritus. The impact was devastating, and there were no survivors among the occupants. The official investigation, supported by ATR and the BEA, recovered the black boxes and confirmed that the ATR-72 was in good condition. The aircraft entered a zone of severe icing at 20,000 feet, lost lift and control, and the pilots did not correctly follow procedures, resulting in an unrecoverable stall. All 68 occupants were killed. The fuselage was destroyed and burned. The victims were found in their seats and taken to the Institute of Forensic Medicine. Argentina repatriated its 10 deceased citizens. The case highlighted the vulnerability of ATR aircraft in extreme icing, leading some countries to strengthen procedures and training. In Guasimal, a plaque was placed in memory of the victims, and the accident remains one of the worst in Cuban aviation history. This model, manufactured since 1989 by the ATR Consortium, formed by Airbus and Leonardo, has been involved in at least 66 incidents, of which 40 resulted in total loss, and 13 caused fatalities as of August 2024. Several of these events were linked to icing conditions, highlighting both the aircraft's limitations and the dangers associated with extreme weather environments. Some notable examples include American Eagle Flight 4184, 1994, United States, the model's first fatal accident. Ice formation on the ailerons caused a loss of control during approach, killing 68 people. Trans-Asia Airways Flight 791, 2002, Taiwan, encountered severe in-flight icing and ended up crashing into the sea. Both pilots were killed. UTair Flight 120, 2012, Russia. Without proper pre-dicing and with subsequent ice buildup, the crew lost control minutes after takeoff. 33 of the 43 people on board died. Yeti Airlines Flight 691, 2023, Nepal. During approach, the aircraft crashed following incorrect propeller handling. Although the investigation pointed more toward operational errors than icing, all 72 people on board were killed. Vopas Flight 2283, 2024, Brazil, an ATR 72-500 fell from 17,000 feet into an urban area near Vinhedo. All 62 occupants died. The preliminary report indicated the pilots had reported intermittent de-icing system problems in a region with an official icing warning between 12,000 and 21,000 feet. Witnesses recorded the plane spiraling down before impact. November 4, 2010, left a deep mark on Cuban skies. That day, 68 people were traveling driven by routine, hope, or excitement, unaware that their journey would be cut short by an invisible combination of errors and circumstances. A mix of extreme weather and an aircraft with little tolerance for errors in icing conditions created a situation in which the margin for reaction vanished within seconds. In aviation, a massive structural collapse or a perfect storm is not always necessary to trigger a tragedy. All it takes is a single element mishandled at the worst possible moment for everything to fall apart.
Torre, Aeroperú 603. Torre, Aeroperú 603.
Aeroperú 603, torre, prosiga.
Que declaramos emergencia, no tenemos instrumentos básicos, ni altímetro, ni velocímetro. Declaramos emergencia.
Without essential instruments, Aeroperú Flight 603, September 29, 1996. Only 3 days remained before the catastrophe. Dawn was breaking at Jorge Chávez International Airport in Lima. It was around 6:30 in the morning when a Boeing 757 lined up on the runway for takeoff. Its route was scheduled between Lima and Mexico City with an approximate duration of 4 hours and 50 minutes each way. At 6:45, the modern jet began its takeoff roll. The powerful roar of its engines startled a flock of birds near the runway. One of them unexpectedly crossed the path and was ingested by the left engine. In the cockpit, the pilots noticed a slight thud, but the engine continued functioning normally and no warning system was triggered. Thus, the aircraft continued its route to Mexico without further incident. The aircraft belonged to Aeroperú, the country's flag carrier, which at the time was celebrating 23 years of operations. It had been manufactured on November 16, 1992, making it just 3 years and 11 months old. It was leased by the company a year and a half after its construction and had been flying in Peruvian skies for over 2 years. It was the second Boeing 757 in the airline's fleet. At the time, Aeroperú was going through serious financial difficulties, allegedly due to poor management. Citing this reason, the government decided to privatize the company in 1993, with Aeromexico emerging as the strongest buyer. After the acquisition, the Mexican airline aimed to revitalize the carrier. The corporate image was revamped, safety standards were adjusted, and operations were expanded to international destinations. Officially, Aeroperú was said to be entering a new phase of growth, although in reality, corruption and political interests continued to shape its course. Upon arrival in Mexico and after disembarking the passengers, a routine visual inspection of the aircraft was carried out. There it was discovered that 2 blades of the left engine were damaged. It was then ordered that, upon return to Lima, the aircraft should be taken directly to the hangar for repairs. Back in Peru, and following the mechanic's instructions, the 757 was moved to the hangar to replace the damaged turbine components. The work had to be completed quickly. In aviation, an aircraft grounded on the tarmac generates no income, only losses. Thus, the maintenance team rushed to complete the repair against the clock. It was October 1st, 18 hours before the disaster. The Boeing 757, registration OB1718, sporting Aeroperú's new livery, white upper fuselage, a blue and red stripe across the middle, and a metallic underbelly, had only been on the ground for 2 days. While it was in the hangar, it also received a touch-up paint job. To protect the static ports, the technicians covered them with adhesive tape. The engine had already been repaired, and everything seemed to be in order. Around 11 at night, the aircraft painter finished his job. At 11:10 p.m., the aircraft went through a maintenance inspection. 2 maintenance supervisors examined it, followed by a quality control inspector. No one noticed anything unusual. Around 11:50, the captain arrived for his pre-flight inspection. Using a flashlight, he walked around the aircraft's exterior, but also failed to detect any irregularities. After a long day in the hangar, the 757 was towed to the apron. In the departure lounge, 61 passengers, many connecting from Miami en route to Chile, received the long-awaited announcement they could board. On board were also 7 flight attendants and 2 experienced pilots. The captain was Eric Schreiber, 58 years old with over 21,000 flight hours and an extensive career in Peruvian aviation. In addition to being a Boeing 757 instructor, he served as the airline's chief pilot. His co-pilot was David Fernandez, 42 years old, with nearly 8,000 flight hours, 719 of which were in that specific model. A veteran crew aboard a young aircraft was preparing for a routine night flight. Shortly after midnight, Boeing 757 registration OB1718 began taxiing toward the threshold of runway 15 at Jorge Chavez Airport. The crew completed their checklists without issue. Air traffic control assigned them transponder code 5603, under which they would appear on radar. Conditions were favorable. The atmosphere was calm, with no storms or rain. Although there was 69% lunar illumination that night, the moon had set hours earlier, leaving the sky completely dark. This posed no problem for an instrument flight aboard an aircraft equipped with modern navigation technology. At 12:42 a.m. on October 2nd, 1996, the captain applied thrust. The Pratt & Whitney engines roared as the 757 accelerated down the runway and lifted off into the southern sky. Within seconds of climbing, co-pilot Fernandez noticed something strange in his instruments. The speed and altitude readings didn't make sense. In the cockpit, the static pressure indicators were obstructed, causing the altimeters and airspeed indicators to display contradictory or impossible data. Almost immediately, multiple alarms began sounding. Overspeed warnings, stall alerts, and messages indicating airspeed discrepancies between the instruments. Captain Schreiber took control and ordered a right turn while reviewing the emergency procedure manuals. But the situation was chaotic. The flight computer was receiving incorrect data from the block sensors, and each alarm that went off only added to the confusion. The crew decided to disconnect the autopilot and declare an emergency. Lima, Aeroperú 603, we have an emergency. We've lost basic instruments, no altimeter, no airspeed indicators. From that moment on, in complete darkness and over the Pacific Ocean, the crew was flying without any reliable references. The Aeroperú 757 was moving away from the coast and out over the sea, while confusion in the cockpit continued to grow. The pilots couldn't agree on what was happening. The alarms were sounding non-stop, and the instruments were giving impossible readings. Co-pilot Fernandez was trying to stabilize the aircraft, but the indicators were showing contradictory numbers. At times, they seemed normal, giving the crew brief moments of confidence, only to then return to absurd and conflicting values. The Lima area controller, observing the aircraft on radar, saw it as stable at around 10,700 feet. What he didn't know was that the radar was receiving the same faulty data coming from the 757 systems. In reality, the plane was in a continuous descent toward the ocean. Each time the dynamic pressure in the block sensors changed, the airspeed indicators became even more erratic, sometimes displaying overspeed, other times indicating a stall. This triggered opposite alarms simultaneously, overspeed warnings alongside stall alerts. Convinced at times that the aircraft was at risk of stalling, the captain pulled the nose up sharply, but in doing so, without realizing it, he was actually steepening the descent angle. The ground proximity warning system, a GPWS, began to sound. Terrain, terrain, pull up, pull up. But the crew, overwhelmed by the flood of alarms, believed it was just another false warning from the faulty instruments. They chose to ignore it. Is there any aircraft that can assist us to confirm our speed and altitude? But at that moment, there was no other aircraft nearby that could provide visual confirmation. They were alone, in the total darkness of the Pacific, trying to fly without essential data. Inside the cockpit, the tension was unbearable. The alarms wouldn't stop, and every attempt to correct the flight only made things worse. Although the instruments showed that the plane was level, in reality it continued descending toward the sea. Exhausted, the co-pilot requested support from ATC Lima 603. We have no basic instruments, no altimeter or airspeed indicators. We are declaring an emergency. The controller tried to help, but the radar was also displaying faulty information. According to the screen, the 757 was still at nearly 10,000 feet, when in truth it was descending dangerously. Suddenly, the GPWS issued its warning. Whoop, whoop, pull up, pull up! The captain raised the nose. The aircraft climbed for a few seconds, but soon a false overspeed warning appeared, sowing more doubt. They disengaged the autopilot and tried to continue manually, but without real references, everything was chaos. The descent became inevitable. The cockpit was overwhelmed with alarms and voices urging calm. In the darkness, with no visible horizon, it was impossible to tell the sky from the sea.
¿Hay algún avión que pueda salir a rescate de nosotros? Espérate, no.
Sí, por eso vamos a coordinar de inmediato. Está coordinando de inmediato. Estaría listo para 6 minutos para proseguir con ayuda.
2 mile terrain. 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 Wind shear. Wind shear. Wind shear. 2 mile terrain.
Que está efectuando
2 mile terrain.
Está circulando hacia el oeste.
Estamos rumbo a 250, pero estamos yendo hacia el mar porque tenemos mensaje de terreno, a darme terreno.
Sí, afirmativo, pero es que está a 42 días volando por rumbo hacia el oeste, rumbo 250, hacia el oeste.
Estamos sobre el agua, ¿no es cierto?
2 mile terrain. 2 mile terrain.
¿Cuál es la altura que indica el avión? Tiene
2 mile terrain. 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 2 mile terrain.
Estamos impactando en agua.
2 mile terrain. 2 mile terrain. 2 mile terrain. 2 mile terrain. 2 miles to range. 2 miles to range.
At 1:11 a.m. on October 2nd, 1996, Aeroperu's Boeing 757 crashed into the Pacific Ocean, just 29 minutes after takeoff. There were no survivors among the 70 people on board, 61 passengers and 9 crew members. The investigation concluded that the static ports had been left covered with adhesive tape after maintenance. This rendered the flight instruments useless. The error went undetected during pre-flight checks, and Boeing had no procedure in place for this specific type of emergency. The crash became one of the most remembered tragedies in Latin American aviation. A human error on the ground, incomplete inspections, and the lack of proper protocols were enough to cost 70 lives in just half an hour. Aeroperú, already weakened, would cease operations in March 1999. Beyond technical reports, the tragedy left a deep void. Families, passengers, and crew members who never returned home. This account is a tribute to each one of them. May they rest in peace, and may their memory keep alive the vital importance of learning from our mistakes.